the most liberal provision for religious freedom anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Specifically said it did have a requirement that everyone believe in God, but beyond that it said that Jews, Quakers, and other heathens were welcome. And what they were thinking of, the Quakers were the early capitalists in London. And the Huguenots became among the early settlers, and many of them were early capitalists. And Jews had already become international traders. And so they wanted to develop this colony economically, and that was part of that. But many of the original settlers came from Barbados, which had the most advanced plantations and the most advanced forms of slavery probably in the world. And many of these were the second and third sons of plantation owners in an age of primogeniture. And so they settled at Albemarle Point and then moved to Charleston a couple decades later. The only English walled city in America was around Charleston, downtown Charleston, stretching roughly from parts of Water Street, which is where there was a creek that divided to stop the high ground, and along East Bay, and then coming up to Market Street and coming back over to Meeting Street. And there are maps now that you can trace those boundaries. And slavery became a key element in the economic development of the state, particularly with rice and indigo in the early days. And then one of the colonial governors had a provision for that each person who settled, each male could get a land grant of so many acres, or something like 50 acres for each person affiliated with him, including his children, probably nieces and nephews, and slaves. And so slavery became intertwined from the beginning in the economic development of South Carolina. And some of the readings that you were sent talk about the early settlers and the whole role of slavery and what it did in creating a planter class, and then their domination of the state politically. And as the backcountry, or the upcountry today as it's called, became settled, and many of those early settlers were Scotch-Irish who came down from Pennsylvania through Virginia and North Carolina. So you have Lancaster County, South Carolina, and 3 other counties, Chester County, South Carolina, and a couple of others that were named for counties in Pennsylvania, or cities in Pennsylvania. And they tended to be Presbyterian, Scots-Irish, who were sometimes known as people who, my first wife was Scots-Irish, so I have a little background there. At least my children have a stronger background. But they were known as people who kept the 10 Commandments and everything else they could get their hands on. So by the time of the Revolutionary War, you'd also had 2 different groups of German immigrants. One that settled primarily in what is today's Lexington and Newberry counties, and they were early Lutherans, and it's their descendants who created the Southern Lutheran Seminary in Columbia. It's the only Lutheran seminary in the South. And another group came a little later, the Palatine Germans from a different part of what consisted of Germany at the time, and they were sent. They were penniless for the most part. And people like some of my ancestors of Strom Thurmond and Brian Dorn were descended from those early groups there. And they were sent to provide sort of a barrier of protection against the Stono Indians. And then you had the Welch came down. Dorchester County is named for Welch Baptists who came down from Dorchester, Massachusetts. And you had Welch settlers, particularly in the Horry County area, and that in the PD. So it was, but as far as England itself, South Carolina had the smallest percentage of any of the original colonies of actual English settlers. Now today's Great Britain provided about 90% of the total. And then you had Irish who came in. And finally, the Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim means Holy Congregation, House of God, is the oldest Reformed Jewish congregation in America, and it granted a lot it owned to the Catholics who founded St. Mary's Church, the first Catholic congregation in Charleston in the late 18th century, and with sort of the thought it'd be better to have two religious minorities than one. And recently the two congregations had a block party together this year. So, as you know, Charleston has tradition, and South Carolina has history. And so slavery was not a benign institution. It was sort of a combination of paternalism and control. And I'm going to just read you one paragraph out of the book. It gives you a less than beautiful picture. It's talking about how slavery operated in the early 19th century. It says, in the interior of the state, speculators bought slaves in the upper South and sold them farther south. South Carolina's old Edgefield district included eight such firms. The slaves were transported by forced march overland in a coffle, traveling about 20 miles a day, and then placed in pens and auctioned like cattle. The slave Charles Ball, sold by his master in Maryland about 1805 and marched into South Carolina for resale, left a vivid account of his experience. I'm quoting. The women, 2 of them pregnant, were merely tied together with a rope about the size of a bed cord, which was tied like a halter around the neck of each. But the men, of whom I was the stoutest and strongest, were very differently caparisoned. A strong iron collar was closely fitted by means of a padlock round each of our necks. A chain of iron about 100 feet in length was passed through the hasp of each padlock. We were handcuffed in pairs, and the poor man to whom I was thus ironed wept like an infant when the blacksmith with his heavy hammer fastened the end of the bolts that kept the staples from slipping through our arms. And so South Carolina had, a couple of crises. South Carolinians tend to, the state is sort of like one great big small town. And, most families and most natives of South Carolina are descended, my father was an immigrant, but most families are descended from generations back, and many generations back. And so, there's a great deal of people in Charleston being related to people in Anderson or Greenville or York or Columbia. And the same in reverse, through intermarriage and so forth. So, the first two things, James McBride Davis once said that the first two things the Southerner meeting a stranger is, where are you from? Trying to place them. And if you're, say you're from New Jersey, they might likely just say, oh. Turns out you're from Texas, you might say, some of my people went to Texas back in the 1880s, and I wonder if you know anybody, the person's last name. And so and the next question is, like in Japan, the first polite question is, how old are you? In South Carolina, it's more likely to be, what church do you go to? And again, it's a way of placing